In the winter of 1895, when the streets of rural Kentucky lay under a thin crust of frost and the wind carried the far-off toll of church bells that seemed to ring for no soul in particular, St. Mercy General Hospital opened its towering oak doors for the first time, its 3 stories of red brick and pale limestone rising from the edge of town like some patient predator that had learned long ago how to hide its hunger, and the townsfolk, poor farmers, coal miners, and widows scraping by on the kindness of neighbors, greeted it as a blessing. For at last there was a place where sickness could be treated without the day-long train ride to Louisville, where midwives could bring difficult births under the watch of trained physicians, where the old could take their last breaths in white-sheeted beds instead of on the cold planks of their cabins. But behind that shining promise lay a shadow few could see, for the money that raised St. Mercy's walls came not from the church nor from the county's meager coffers, but from the estate of a man as mysterious in death as he had been in life. Elias Greer, a reclusive distiller who had not been glimpsed in public for 22 years before his passing, and who in his will left half his fortune to build a hospital that did not yet exist, with a single unnerving condition. Every brick, bed frame, and surgical tool must be purchased from a list of suppliers he himself named, all of them located in eastern seaboard states, all of them inexplicably vanishing from public record within a year of his death, leaving behind no ledgers, no correspondence, no trace of their operations. The town, dazzled by the prospect of its own grand hospital, asked few questions, and so on. Opening day, horse-drawn carriages ferried the wealthiest families up the graveled drive to admire the marble-floored lobby with its gleaming brass railings, the bright operatin, Nang Theater lit by tall windows spilling pale winter light, and the East Wing's 30 beds dressed in crisp linens that smelled faintly of camphor and lavender. But there were those with keener senses, like old Reverend Mather, who claimed to smell rot in places where others smelled nothing, who found themselves unsettled, for the building seemed less built than transplanted whole, as if its walls had already known years of whispered prayers and final breaths in some other place. During its first year, St. Mercy admitted 92 patients, 32 of whom recovered, 28 discharged in stable condition, and 32 who never left at all, their deaths noted in the hospital's heavy black ledger in the spidery hand of Malcolm Thorne, chief physician, always with vague causes: fever, heart failure, respiratory collapse, never diagnoses that could be challenged, never details a grieving family could question, and those bodies were hurried into the ground, sometimes within hours, the hospital citing public health measures in an age when such phrases ended arguments. Dr. Thorne himself was a gaunt man with deep-set eyes, a voice that drained all emotion into a flat monotone, and an ever-present cane he seemed never to need for walking. And though his patient files were thorough to the point of obsession, there was in his care a detached, observing quality, as though he were recording an ongoing experiment whose purpose only he understood. The staff in those early years numbered just 8, 3 nurses, 2 orderlies, a cook, a janitor, and undertaker Hollis Crane, who doubled as the town's gravedigger, and each would later be remembered as having changed after time within those walls, their tempers shorter, their eyes carrying the far-off stare of those who had walked too many silent corridors where every step seemed to echo longer than it should, but for a time the town chalked it up to the strain of hospital work. Yet whispers began to take root, carried from the coal pits to the saloon, that some patients hadn't been ill at all when admitted, not in any way visible, and yet, within days, sometimes mere hours, they were gone. The first death to truly trouble the town came in February 1896, when Clara Whitcomb, a young schoolteacher with only a mild cough, was admitted one afternoon and dead by the next morning, her hands so tightly clenched the undertaker had to break her fingers to straighten them, and while Dr. Thorne's report listed sudden pulmonary failure, Clara's sister swore she had heard her whisper through the ward's frosted window that night, a single word word, stay. Whether a plea or a warning, none could agree, and her death joined the ledger as one more mound in the churchyard. Over the next 4 years the deaths mounted, 30, 40, then 50, spread just widely enough across outlying farms and families that few saw the whole picture, save Reverend Mather, who began keeping his own list, noting not just names but the hour of death, discovering that most passed between midnight and 3 in the morning, when the night nurse, Mrs. Prentice, worked alone. Still, St. Mercy's reputation remained strong, for it saved many lives as well, and in an era where mortality was a constant, a handful of strange passings could be buried in the tide of consumption, cholera, and childbirth gone wrong. But if you asked the old men smoking on the feed store steps, they would tell you that St. Mercy's windows glowed strangely at night, the lamplight too dim or too red, and that sometimes shadows moved against the curtains in rooms that were supposed to be empty. And so, though no one yet spoke of curses or bargains, the quiet dread had already taken root, and those who felt it knew, though they could not prove, that this place had not been built to save the living, but to gather the dying in one place, and whatever purpose Elias Greer had written into his will had nothing at all to do with mercy. By the turn of the century, the air around St. Mercy General had thickened with a kind of heaviness that was hard to name, an invisible weight that settled on the chest and made every breath feel slightly borrowed, and while the townsfolk still spoke of the hospital as a necessity, an indispensable fixture in a place where winters bit deep and epidemics traveled fast, those who had reason to walk its corridors after nightfall knew that necessity did not mean safety. The pattern, though not yet spoken aloud, was already taking shape in the ledgers and in the memories of the undertaker, Hollis Crane, who by 1901 had dug more graves for St. Mercy's dead than for all other causes combined, and who had begun to note in his own weather-beaten journal the uncanny recurrence of certain details, the way most deaths occurred in winter or late autumn when the fog lay low on the river and the fields stood barren, the way nearly all of them happened between the hours of midnight and 3, the way the dying seemed to speak of dreams, or worse, of voices, before slipping away, often while their bodies still held a healthy color, as though their hearts had simply decided to stop in unison with something unseen. And if one traced the pattern backward, as Reverend Mather quietly did in the cracked margins of his Bible, it began to resemble a grim tide, a swelling wave of mortality that rose every few years to a peak before ebbing, only to return with greater force. Between 1895 and 1900, there were 82 deaths, but from 1901 to 1906, the number rose to 121, and with each year the stories circling in the saloons and sewing rooms of the town grew stranger. Patients who had checked in with nothing more than a fever claiming to see their dead relatives in the corners of their rooms, women recovering from childbirth, waking in the night to the sound of someone whispering their names, only to find the ward empty, and men who, in their final days, began clawing at the walls as though trying to get out, leaving deep scratches in the plaster that the orderlies would paint over before the next patient arrived. Yet, despite these murmurs, the hospital continued to attract the sick from miles around, for in those cases where death did not come, recovery was swift and near miraculous, as though whatever force moved through the place could choose on a whim whom to take and whom to leave behind, and Dr. Malcolm Thorne remained its central figure, his gaunt frame a constant in every corridor, his dark eyes seeming to study not just the patients but the nurses, the visitors, even the priests who came to administer last rites, as though measuring something in them the rest could not see. Mrs. Prentice, the night nurse whose shift coincided with so many of the hospital's deaths, became a figure of quiet speculation, never overtly accused but never entirely trusted, for she had the unsettling habit of being at the bedsides of those who passed even when they had not been listed as critical, and, though she claimed it was diligence, Some began to believe she was following a calling of her own, one tied to the strange instructions Elias Greer had left behind, instructions no one outside the hospital administration had ever read. In 1904, an outbreak of scarlet fever swept through the county, filling all 30 beds of the East Wing within a week, and though the disease claimed many across the state, St. Mercy's losses were disproportionate. 27 dead in a single month, their bodies removed before dawn under heavy canvas sheets and buried by Hollis Crane without ceremony, their graves marked only by simple wooden crosses that would rot within a year, erasing them from memory as effectively as if they had never lived. It was after this that the first real challenge to the hospital's practices emerged, when a farmer named Eli Darnell demanded the exhumation of his 10-year-old son, convinced that the boy had been buried alive after hearing muffled sounds from a coffin during the funeral. The request was denied by county officials, swayed by Dr. Thorne's impeccable reputation and his assertion that grief had clouded the man's mind. But the rumor spread quickly, and though no one dared confront the doctor directly, there were those who began avoiding St. Mercy entirely, choosing to risk death at home rather than place themselves under its roof. Still, the majority came, and the deaths continued, and by 1908 the total number had reached 213, more than the town's population on some census rolls, and it was in this year that a young county coroner named Samuel Harkett, newly appointed and too green to have learned the value of silence, began to take notice. Harkett had inherited the old records from his predecessor, and spent long winter nights poring over them by lamplight, aligning dates, cross-referencing causes of death, and slowly realizing that what had seemed like a trickle of misfortune over the years was in fact a concentrated flow, a relentless harvest that moved with an almost mechanical rhythm. He noted that certain rooms, specifically those in the East Wing facing the river, accounted for more than half the deaths, and that these rooms were always occupied during the peak months, even when healthier patients could have been moved there. He also found, in the margin of an old ledger, a faint, half-erased note written in a hand he did not recognize. "Do not place them near the river when the moon is low," a line that made no medical sense, but which he underlined and returned to often in his thoughts. When he approached Dr. Thorne with his concerns, the older man listened without interrupting, his face unreadable in the flickering light of his office lamp, and when Harkett had finished, Thorne simply said, "Patterns are for the living, Mr. Harkett. The dead have no use for them," before turning back to his paperwork effectively ending the conversation. But Harkett could not let it go, and over the next 2 years he visited St. Mercy frequently under the guise of routine inspections, slipping into unused wards and storage rooms, noting the smell of damp stone in the East Wing's basement, the faint traces of salt along the baseboards as if someone had tried to keep something in or out, and the way the old floorboards there seemed to hum faintly underfoot when the wind came off the river. In 1910, a particularly harsh winter froze the river solid and brought an influx of pneumonia cases, and in the weeks that followed, Harkett counted 18 deaths, all between midnight and 3, all in the same 4 rooms, and all of the bodies, when prepared for burial, bearing the same small, dark bruise at the base of the skull, so precise in its placement that it could not be accidental. When he finally pressed the matter with the county commissioners, they reminded him of Mercy's indispensable service, of Dr. Thorne's unmatched credentials, and of the political consequences of stirring unrest in a town already strained by mining strikes. And so the coroner found himself silenced not by threat, but by the heavy machinery of institutional will. Still, he kept his notes, adding to them until the day he vanished in the spring of 1911, after telling a colleague he had found the ledger Elias Greer meant them to hide, a statement whose meaning was never explained, for his body was never found. By then, the pattern had become undeniable to those willing to see it. Deaths rising and falling in a grim rhythm, concentrated in certain rooms at certain hours under certain conditions. And yet, the hospital remained open, its brick walls unweathered by time, its windows reflecting the moonlight in a way that made it hard to tell whether the building was keeping something in or looking out over the town like a sentinel, counting the days until its work was complete. And though no official ever used the word curse, those who had buried too many friends under St. Mercy's shadow began to speak of it as if it were a living thing, a creature with a hunger that could not be sated, a hunger that had been planted there in 1895 and which, 16 years later, had not diminished but had only grown more deliberate, more precise, as though it were following instructions left long ago by hands that had never truly been laid to rest. By the autumn of 1911, with the frost creeping in early, and the river running black under a low, sullen sky, the unease that had long clung to St. Mercy General began to sharpen into something the townspeople could no longer ignore. For the disappearance of County Coroner Samuel Harkett had not been treated as an accident by those who knew him, and though the official explanation spoke of a possible fall into the river during a night inspection, the truth that settled in the minds of miners, widows, and old veterans was that he had gotten too close to whatever the hospital's walls were built to conceal. Yet life in the county had always demanded compromise. Coal still needed to be dug, crops still needed to be harvested, and so, even as whispers about the East Wing spread, the sick kept coming, and the ledger kept filling with neat black lines marking the end of lives. But in November of that year, a single, unplanned event began the unraveling of the hospital's carefully maintained facade. A violent storm, the kind that peeled shingles from rooftops and drove fence posts from the earth, tore a section of the East Wing's roof away in the night, and when the wind finally quieted, the damage revealed more than the weathered rafters. A section of the upper wall had caved inward, exposing a hidden crawl space no more than 4 feet high, running the length of the wing, its interior lined with narrow slots like pigeonholes, each one containing a long, cylindrical object wrapped in yellowed cloth. The discovery was made not by hospital staff, but by 2 young orderlies sent to clear debris, and though they were ordered by Dr. Thorne to leave the area immediately, one, William Cade, a restless 20-year-old with a habit of asking questions, could not resist pulling the cloth from one of the shapes, revealing a human skull so clean it seemed to have been boiled, its eye sockets packed with small dried herbs that gave off a smell both sweet and nauseating, a smell that would later haunt Cade in his sleep. Before they could examine further, Mrs. Prentice appeared in the corridor, her voice low but edged with a kind of steel, telling them that if they valued their lives, they would forget what they had seen. But Cade had already seen too much, and that night he took what he had found to Reverend Mather, who listened without interruption before disappearing into his study for several minutes, and returning with a brittle sheaf of papers bound with twine, a copy, he explained, of Elias Greer's original will, one he had obtained years earlier when the hospital was being built, though he had never dared to share it. The document, in Greer's spidery hand, outlined a series of requirements for the hospital's design: that the east wing be constructed over the deepest point of the riverbank, that beneath its floors a stone foundation be laid using blocks imported from a dismantled asylum in Maryland, and that the resting places be prepared in advance, so the harvest may be made without delay. A phrase so unsettling that Cade, who had little education, understood immediately that the slots he had seen were no accident, but part of the building's intended purpose. Over the next week, as repairs on the east wing continued under unusually heavy supervision from Dr. Thorne and Mrs. Prentice, Cade began to notice that certain patients were being moved there, even though other, safer rooms were available, and within days those patients were dead, each one removed before dawn and buried with the same haste that had become the hospital's hallmark. Driven by a mixture of fear and stubbornness, Cade enlisted the help of Hollis Crane, the Bauta died. E. undertaker who had dug nearly every grave in the county for the past 2 decades, and together they opened one of the more recent burials, a young mother named Elsie Vaughn, finding not only that her body was missing the small bones of both hands, but that her skull bore the same herbs in the eye sockets as the one in the crawlspace. Crane, whose hands had buried more dead than he cared to count, sat down hard in the wet grass, muttering that this was not medicine, not any kind he knew, but something older, something that had been practiced before the county had a name, before the river had been mapped. Something to do with binding the spirit to the place where the body had been taken apart. They decided then that the truth had to be brought to the sheriff, but when they arrived at his office, they found Der Thorn already there, speaking quietly with him in the lamplight, and the moment Cade stepped into the room, the sheriff's expression told him that whatever complaint he lodged would go no further. The next morning, Hollis Crane's body was found floating in the river, his death ruled accidental, despite the bruising on his throat, and Cade, realizing he had become a marked man, fled town before nightfall, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note for Reverend Mather that read, "It's the building. It feeds." Over the following months, the pattern of deaths shifted slightly, still concentrated in the East Wing, still in the midnight hours, but now the patients often spoke of hearing water dripping in their rooms even when the pipes were dry, of smelling the same cloying herbal scent Cade had described, and a few, in their final hours, claimed to see the man with no eyes standing at the foot of their bed, his hands resting on the brass rail, waiting. By the winter of 1912, the death count had slowed not because the hospital had ceased its work, but because the town's population had thinned, families leaving for other counties, taking their sick and their children far from the river's edge. Yet St. Mercy remained open, its windows lit at night, the East Wing repaired, and its crawl space sealed once more. It was Reverend Mather, frail and coughing blood into a handkerchief, who made the last recorded attempt to expose the truth, delivering to the State Medical Board a packet of documents including Greer's will, Harkett's notes, and Cade's testimony, but the packet never arrived, and when a clerk was sent to Mather's home to inquire, he was found in his bed, eyes open, a faint trace of dried herbs beneath his lids. His death was listed in the county ledger as natural causes, and with him died the last organized resistance to whatever force moved through the East Wing. Years later, when the hospital finally closed under the pretense of structural disrepair in 1930, the demolition crew reported finding the foundation stones damp to the touch, despite the dry season, and beneath them, a hidden channel cut directly into the riverbank, wide enough for a man to crawl through, its walls stained with something darker than water. The stones themselves were removed and sold off to builders in other towns, and to this day, houses built from that stone have been plagued by sudden, unexplained deaths, though never in numbers to rival the harvest that once took place in St. Mercy General. The official record will tell you that in its 35 years of operation, the hospital served thousands and saved many, but it will not tell you that for 16 of those years, the East Wing consumed at least 213 souls, taken not by disease or chance, but by design, as part of a bargain struck in the pages of a will written by a man whose name still lingers in the county like the taste of something bitter in the mouth, a reminder that some buildings are not constructed merely of stone and timber, but of intent, and that once such a place is given purpose, it will go on feeding until it is torn down, or until it has taken everything it was promised.